In the late 90s, a band called Union was formed, consisting of former Motley Crue and Kiss members. They recorded 2 albums, but due to a lack of momentum, they ended up calling it quits and focusing on other projects. The 2 albums were recently reissued on vinyl, and I think they're massively underrated, so we're going to talk about them and the band's brief history. Before we get started, be sure to like and subscribe, and you can support the channel on Patreon. Born in 1959, John Corabi made his first splash on the rock scene as the lead singer of the band The Scream. Formed in 1989, the band released their debut album, Let It Scream, in 1991. A very solid album that Nikki Sixx of Motley Crue was impressed with. When Motley Crue's lead singer Vince Neil quit or was fired, depending on who you ask, Sixx and Tommy Lee reached out to Corabi and he became the new lead singer and rhythm guitarist of Motley Crue. He recorded 1 album with the band, which was released in 1994. It underperformed, which put the band and label into freak-out mode, resulting in Neil's return in 1997. Born in 1953, Bruce Kulick got his start in New York in the mid-70s. He got a touring gig with Meatloaf on the Bat Out of Hell tour, as well as briefly playing guitar in a band with Michael Bolton called Blackjack. Yes, that Michael Bolton. In 1984, Kulick joined Kiss on their Animalized tour, initially as a temporary sub for their then guitar player Mark St. John. However, Kulick clicked with the band and he became the official lead guitarist. Kulick would play with Kiss for 12 years, including 5 studio albums: Asylum, Crazy Nights, Hot in the Shade, Revenge, and Carnival of Souls. Notable tracks include Tears Are Falling, Crazy Crazy Nights, Unholy, God Gave Rock and Roll to You, and one of Kiss's biggest hits, Forever. In 1996, Kiss's leaders, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, decided to reunite with original drummer Peter Criss and original lead guitarist Ace Frehley, leaving Kulick and then drummer Eric Singer without a job. Kulick knew he would have to start from the ground up, so he spoke to Larry Mazer, who had been Kiss's manager from 1989 to 1994. Mazer suggested Kulick work with Corabi. The two met and hit it off, deciding to form a band with Corabi on lead vocals and rhythm guitar, and Kulick on lead guitar. They recruited Brent Fitz on drums and Jamie Hunting on bass, solidifying the lineup of their new band, Union. Mazer became their manager. For their first record, the band turned to Kurt Cuomo to produce. Kulick had met Cuomo through Stanley, the 3 writing together quite a bit on Kulick's final Kiss album, Carnival of Souls. The band struggled to find a major label that wanted them. Kulick attributes this to how the rock landscape changed following Nirvana. And that's certainly possible, a former member of Motley Crue and a former member of Kiss in those days. But I do think there was a bit of nostalgia for the 70s at that point. Like, you had bands like Foo Fighters and Lenny Kravitz who were a bit more retro, at least in comparison to their contemporaries. Also, Kiss got nominated for their one and only Grammy around this time. Aerosmith had an absolute monster of a hit. Regardless, Union did not find interest from a major label. So they signed with an indie label, Mayhem Records. All the songs on the album were written by Kulick, Corabi, and Cuomo with a couple exceptions. Union's self-titled debut was released on February 24th, 1998. This first record is really good. It's one of my favorite albums. It's criminally underrated. The guitars are all really cool, both rhythm and lead. Incredible solos. I think the songwriting is really strong, particularly the lyrics. I just think it's a really well-written record with a lot of strong musicianship behind it. Union struggled with this first album. Critically, it was decently received. And while it did okay for an independent release, it didn't exactly set the world on fire. Kulick said, "We were just lumped into that category of the old guard in an era when the new guard was in, and so we just didn't get a break. If we had gotten a tour with one of those bulletproof bands who, no matter what the flavor of music is, let's say an Alice Cooper tour or something, we would have maybe had some exposure. But we couldn't gain traction, and we didn't get offered any significant tours like that. And that made for a very hard road to travel." The band toured clubs and played at Kiss Expos, building a grassroots effort called the Union Workforce. Kulick continued, "I knew I had to go back to a very low-budget version of touring, and as hard as that was, I really did believe in the music and the band. I do remember that the fans were incredible. I mean, those people got it, and as much as they might have been excited about Kiss being back in makeup, they didn't forget me. They loved our music, they'd show up, they'd help sell the merchandise, they'd be our runners, and they would just be so supportive. During that tour, the opportunity arose to record a live album. Corabi said, "The bottom line is Mayhem was falling apart, we had no support, and basically they went belly up and we were kinda out there with no support from a label. No label, to be honest with you. And we came back to LA and we did 2 shows with Cinderella, and the first we did was at a place called the Key Club here in Hollywood, and they were doing some recording for a live record. And the guy from the record label heard the band, and he thought that we were really cool, a great band live, and he wanted us to record our set as well and do a live record for his label. And we thought it might be kind of a cool idea considering we had no label and didn't even know if we would get signed again. So we just figured it'd be a way for us to take those songs from the first album and kind of re-release them in a different format and hopefully keep our fingers crossed that we were sitting on Frampton Comes Alive. That album became Live at the Galaxy, released in 1999. It's a very cool live album featuring songs from their debut album, as well as 2 Kiss songs from Carnival of Souls, 1 song from Corabi's Motley Crue album, 1 The Scream song, and a couple covers. It's not currently on Spotify, but it is getting a vinyl reissue soon, so hopefully it'll be on Spotify too. Spitfire Records acquired Mayhem and thus Union. They reissued the debut album in 1999 with a bonus track, a cover of the Beatles' Oh Darling. And then Union set to make their follow-up album. For a producer, they teamed with Bob Marlett. Corabi said it was because we actually have the same manager. I have 2 managers that I've had since my days with The Scream, and Bruce has a manager that, Larry Mazer, who used to manage Kiss there for a while. So when we joined forces, we kept our managers, and my managers and his manager worked together. But my guys handle us, and they handle Bob Marlett. So I guess they must have been playing him our first record, and telling him we were getting ready to do another album, and see if he'd be interested in working with us. We sat down, and we talked with him for a while, and he had a lot of great ideas. I think it's also interesting to note that around the same time, Marlett produced 2 Alice Cooper albums, 2000's Brutal Planet, and 2001's Dragon Town, both of which were Spitfire releases. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, or if it's just a fun coincidence. The Blue Room was a much more collaborative album when the first record had been mostly written by Corabi and Kulick with Cuomo. Corabi said, "We all kind of developed the songs together. The first record was Bruce and I in the studio with this guy Kurt Cuomo, and we recorded it at home, and Kurt basically sat down with us, and we all figured out what drum parts to play, and played them on a drum machine, and then between me and Bruce playing guitars and stuff like that, we played all the guitars and bass, and then basically when James and Brent joined the band, we just had them play what we already played. This time, there were no demos, we had ideas on tape, we just got together with Bob Marlett and jammed everything as a band, and we kind of sifted through what we thought were the 10 best ideas, and then we developed them as a band. Every song in the Blue Room was written by Corabi, Kulick, Hunting, and Marlett." I think it's an even better album than the first album. I think it's really incredible stuff, in my opinion. Union's sound is a little hard to describe because they don't quite fit into any of the subgenres that were popular at the time. They're hard rock. I think the Beatles influence is very clear. I hear that on the Blue Room especially. It's a heavier 90s Beatles. I think the closest album in comparison to this stuff is the 94 Motley Crue album. A lot of that is obviously the way that Corabi writes, both his riffs and his lyrics, and what he writes about. But they're not really a throwback band, which I think might be part of the problem. You know, they have their own sound, especially on the Blue Room. So they're not really catering to pre-existing Kiss or Motley Crue fans, but they're also not playing what was popular on the radio at the time. Corabi said, "Everybody's concerned with playing the new Limp Bizkit, Kid Rock, Korn, that kind of stuff, and that's basically what's happening. What we're doing, which is just straight ahead rock and roll, as far as the radio stations go, is not in demand." The band toured more clubs in support, but it was not sustainable. Kulick said, "Well, it just got to a point where we almost only could survive by selling some merchandise and at a paltry profit to boot. I just felt like the market was not there for us. I knew we did good work and we backed that up on tour and we'd have offers from Europe to go play, but it would be barely enough to get over there and do it, let alone make any actual money. I just couldn't justify continuing and killing myself, and I realized that it was time to just take a step back and put Union on pause." And sadly, that's what they did. There was brief activity in 2005 with a DVD release filmed on the Blue Room tour, and they played a couple shows in Japan with Singer on drums. But that's it. They all became involved with other projects. Kulick joined Grand Funk Railroad, who he still tours with today, as well as doing 3 solo albums. Corabi joined Rat for a time, and eventually the Dead Daisies, as well as doing some solo stuff. Fitz would eventually join Slash's solo band, in addition to being Kulick's main drummer of choice. Union's legacy is not of a band that changed the world in any stretch of the imagination. They made 2 records that didn't really sell, and then all of its members moved on to projects where they could actually make money. But that doesn't really take away from the quality of the music. If Union has a legacy, it is these 2 great hard rock albums that went underappreciated at the time, but hopefully more people will discover them as time goes on.